Hi, everyone. Welcome to our workshop on how intersections shape youth pathways and prevention. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with the land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nations, signatories to the Williams Treaty. We also recognize the enduring presence and stewardship of other Indigenous nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We honor their ongoing connection to this land, water, and community. We also honor the ancestors of the African descent whose forced and voluntary migrations shaped this land. We recognize the resilience, resistance, and contributions of Black communities in Durham region and across Canada, and we commit to advancing justice, dignity, and collective liberation in their legacy. So before we dive further into this workshop today, I just want to introduce Jasmyne Julien. She will be running the majority of this workshop. So Jasmyne Julien is the founder and director of Revitaled Reintegration Services, a nonprofit focused on enhancing community safety and well-being through Afrocentric lens. With decades of experience in program design and strategy and a BA in criminology from Toronto Metropolitan University, Jasmyne has displayed a relentless commitment to social justice. She has nearly 5 years of experience in government administration, where she applies data, policy analysis, and program development frameworks to combat gendered racism and occupational segregation. An emerging racial justice advocate and sought-after speaker, Jasmyne's efforts have earned recognition, including being named one of Canada's top 100 Black women to watch in 2023 by the CIBWE, an honor recognized by former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. She was also named one of Ontario's Community Changemakers in 2024 and has had her work featured in the Toronto Star and CBC News. And 3 words to describe Jasmyne as that she's harmonious, purposeful, and consistent.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Cynthia, and thank you again to everyone who's joining us on today's workshop. I am just about to switch over my screen. Alrighty. So before I jump into the content for today, I will just be sharing a bit of information about Revitaled. And apologies. Let me see if I can, oops. Alrighty, so Revitaled Reintegration Services, as Cynthia mentioned, is a small nonprofit organization we founded in 2021, and our work centers around promoting community safety and well-being through an Afrocentric lens. We are a Durham-based organization, and a lot of the work that we do centers around just enhancing community outcomes as best as possible for our clients. And we do this through a number of different ways, such as community-based wellness practicing, resource development, education, like sessions like today, and a few other community initiatives that are centered around unique and creative ways to bring justice and safety and wellness education to the community. And here's just a high-level overview of what we'll be talking about today. There's a lot of content that I'm going to try and fit into a 30-minute presentation. And there are some opportunities as well to get hands-on and engaged in today's session as well. And so we'll be exploring more of that as we go along today's presentation. Before we do that, I do want to set the tone with some housekeeping notes. So we might be discussing sensitive topics during today's session. And so it's critical that we approach these conversations with respect and an open mind. So hate, harassment, and harmful comments won't be tolerated in this space. And we believe, as Revitaled and as a team on today's call, that as we share spaces with others, it's up to all of us to contribute to the creation of safer spaces. And part of how we can do this work is by prioritizing being considerate of others' perspectives and histories. And we'll be using a culturally informed lens for today's discussion. And so I believe that we have a diverse diverse professional backgrounds on today's call. And so I know that in this line of work, we can take on heavy subject matter. And so as we approach today's conversation, I do want to encourage all of us to take care of ourselves. If we do find this conversation distressing at any point. And so the phone numbers for mental health and crisis lines are on the screen, and they will be added to the chat as well for future reference. And this workshop is being recorded and will be shared on social media platforms with attendees after this event. And we'll also be sharing some additional resources to support continued learning post-session today. And we'll be interacting using tools like polls on Microsoft Teams, as well as third-party resources like Padlet. So please get your devices ready to engage in the discussions that we'll be having today. And a few additional disclaimers as well. So today is about sharing facts. It's our mission as an organization to improve the safety and wellness of our community. And part of how we do this is by educating the community about barriers that could impede that process. And so educating through evidence is key, which is why I'll be relying on both primary and secondary data sources to inform today's discussion. I'll do my best as well to reference resources throughout this presentation so that you can look up some of the facts and figures yourself on your own when you are ready to dive in deeper into these topics. And also as someone who's been working with vulnerable and crime-exposed youth for about 10 years now, these experiences also inform the discussion that we'll be having today. And then finally, as today's discussion is not meant to be the be-all and end-all, youth crime is shaped by many complex and interconnected factors, and meaningful conversations about influences, prevention, and intervention require nuance and time. And so the sectors represented here in today's discussion, they are doing amazing work across different platforms and across different institutions. So it's great to know that there is work being done to push the needle forward in the province. But that being said, fully examining both the efforts happening on the ground as well as gaps that exist within Ontario would take far more than the hour or less than an hour that we have for today's discussion. And so one of the core goals is to ground ourselves in the realities that many youth face as they navigate these overlapping systems, and to ensure that there are ways that we can move forward to support youth so that they're able to get on and stay on the right path. Right, and so we're going to jump into today's conversation with our first section. And this is where we're going to kick off with some polls. So I'm going to get the polls up on the screen. And so there should be a pop-up that comes on your screen any moment now. And feel free to respond to the polls. We're gonna debunk a few myths here today. So there's some there's some true and false questions. And I'll read off each of the statements here on the screen, and feel free to respond with your answer either in the chat or through the poll. So the first statement is, youth crime is mostly influenced by individual circumstances a young person faces. Second statement, early intervention programs can reduce the likelihood of youth offending. Third statement, unsafe neighborhoods and lack of school support can increase risk for youth offending. Number 4, racialized and marginalized youth face systemic barriers that can increase justice involvement. And the final statement is, access to mental health and substance supports have no effect on youth outcomes. So take a moment to go through those polls. I'll give everyone maybe a minute or so to respond if they haven't already. All right, and I'm seeing some results coming in. So let's start with the first statement. Youth crime is mostly influenced by individual circumstances a young person faces. This is false. So there are multiple factors that shape pathways to youth crime. And research provided by organizations like the World Health Organization that there are numerous factors, not just one factor, but multiple, including family, peers, supports, and community, and systemic influences. And all of these combined can impact youth and their decision to become involved in crime. Right. And I can share, again, a lot of the information I'm sharing today, I can share reports later. We'll share additional resources with all of our attendees for further learning later on. The second statement, right? Early intervention programs can reduce the likelihood of youth offending. This is true. So studies in both Canada and the United States at the institutional and community levels show that programs targeting at-risk youth and families can help to address risk factors before offending occurs. Third statement, unsafe neighborhoods and lack of school support can increase risk for youth offending, and this is also true. As mentioned with statement number 1, there are numerous factors, including environmental stressors, like unsafe neighborhoods or school struggles, that can contribute to a youth's involvement in crime and violence. Statement number 4. So access to mental health and substance supports has no effect on youth outcomes. And this is, oh, sorry, that I read the last statement, but we'll go ahead with that. And that is false. So counseling, therapy, and addiction support reduce crime risks that may lead to crime. And there was a study that was done by the Department of Justice on youth forensic psychiatrist services within British Columbia. And that revealed that access to mental health supports does reduce offending rates amongst youth. And I'll go back to the fourth statement. Racialized and marginalized youth face systemic barriers that can increase justice involvement, and that is true. So there's tons of research out there, tons of research done by the Department of Justice within Canada that argues that systemic inequalities, such as the over-policing of Black and Indigenous youth, can make some youth more likely to encounter the justice system. Right, and so we're going to move on to the next slide. And we're going to have just a bit of a breakdown of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And so when we talk about youth for today's presentation, we're going to largely be speaking on individuals between the ages of 12 and 17, which is the age range that the Youth Criminal Justice Act considers in its legislation as who is defined by a youth, or who is defined as a youth. And so there were a lot of themes in the Q&A exercise that we did that show us that different sectors and systems impact a young person's decision-making process. And this feeds in really nicely to Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which is a model that explores how different systems shape a person's development. And within this framework, there are 5 systems. I'm going to go over each of them at a high level, beginning with microsystems. And so that's the yellow circle that we see here. And this is the immediate environment and direct relationships that impact the young person's life. So that could be their family, their school, peers, work, or other related areas. There's also the mesosystems, and that's the orange ring. And that shows, or that speaks to connections between microsystems, such as a parent, which is a part of a young person's family system, and a teacher and that is within a young person's school system. So there's connections between these two systems. And for example, they could have a conversation about a young person's progress at school. And that would be an example of the mesosystem. There's the exosystem, and those are indirect influences across systems a young person can experience. So that could be community resources or a local government or the media, for example. There's macro systems, which is the purple ring, and those are broader cultural contexts that shape all systems a young person interacts with. And for example, that could be laws, beliefs, or socioeconomic status. And then we have chronosystems, which is the pink ring, the outermost ring. And these are broader, more time-bound events that shape a young person's development across their lifespan. And one example could be a pandemic or other societal changes or life transitions. And understanding this model helps us to understand that within the sectors that youth interact with, there are several layers of influence operating at the same time. So a young person's decision is rarely just about the good or bad options or choices within an isolated moment. It's shaped by broader factors such as what's happening at home, how they're experiencing school, the policies and laws that govern their lives, messages that they receive from media and the culture, among other examples. So when we talk about prevention, interventions, or accountability, we can't just look at the young person or their decisions in isolation. We also have to look at these systems around them. And this perspective can help us to shift conversations that we might have as practitioners or individuals or as a society about what's wrong with this one youth. And we can shift to broader conversations such as what systems are influencing this youth and how can these same systems better support them. Okay. I'm going to go to the next slide. And now that we've kind of acknowledged how youth environments impact development, we can take a closer look at some of the roles that some of these systems and sectors play in a young person's life. And these are not all of the systems that a young person interacts with, but they are some of the more common ones. And so I'm going to dive into just a few of these sectors today in the interest of time. Really wanted to have a broader discussion on all of these, but we can maybe set up another conversation at another time or share some additional resources for further learning. But we'll be touching on just a few of these systems today. And while I'll be making general statements about these systems and how they can impact young people, these are not the experiences of all youth. Young people are not a monolith, as we've discussed today already. I mean, there's identity, culture, race, and so many different intersectionalities and experiences that shape how young people move and are treated within these systems. And I also want to highlight that although these sectors often operate in silos, they are deeply connected. And when young people are not navigating, or young people, they don't navigate one system at a time. They're often navigating several at a time. And we'll talk about some of those intersectionalities across systems today. And before moving on and jumping into some of those systems, I do want to acknowledge that there are many aspects of all these systems that were developed that were not historically designed with racialized youth at the center, especially Black and Indigenous youth. And so it's important to acknowledge that these youth who are often the most overrepresented in some of these systems, like the justice system, for example, are also the most marginalized across these same systems. And we'll touch on some systemic barriers and considerations as we move through each of these sectors today. So we're going to start with the housing sector. So when we talk about housing, we're really talking about a foundation for young people's lives. Ideally, a home is a place of safety and predictability and belonging. And it's unfortunate that that's not the reality that some young people face, but ideally that's what we would hope for young people, especially as practitioners in this space. And so in a report from Housing Infrastructure Canada, it was revealed that up to 47% of respondents in their 2024 study first experienced homelessness before the age of 25. And this includes 14% who first experienced homelessness as children under the age of 13. And so early housing loss or early home instability is strongly linked to longer-term system-wide destabilization that doesn't only impact youth, but their families as well, noting that the youth in the study who experienced homelessness, there were links or there was information provided that suggested that this homelessness that they experienced was due to their family that they stayed with also experienced homelessness as well. And there's a nonprofit organization, Youth Without Shelter, that reports that in Toronto, there's 1,500 to 2,000 youth who may be without stable housing on any given night, with a lot of young people who already face discrimination, conflict, and trauma at home, also experiencing barriers within the housing system beyond that one environment. And reading this information and going through the notes that I have prepared for today's study, or not today's study, but today's presentation, it was difficult to read because I know that when housing is insecure, young people may have to make survival-based decisions that are rooted in anxiety, fear, or power dynamics just to stay safe. And that frequent moves or homelessness could make it harder to stay connected to school, peers, and supports. And all of this contributes to disrupted education and disengagement. And then on top of that, with the stress caused by having to move constantly or not having a stable place to stay, there are underlying mental health struggles that could emerge from that traumatic experience. And on the systemic level, we have to acknowledge that barriers that make housing harder to stabilize, to act, or let me backtrack a little bit. When we take a look at the systemic level, we have to acknowledge barriers that make stable housing harder to access for racialized families and youth. There's research by the Homelessness Hub, and that research states that Black and Indigenous communities are disproportionately represented among people experiencing homelessness relative to their population share. And they point to the impacts of racial discrimination in rental markets, historical dispossession, and economic marginalization. And when we take a deeper look at this, discriminatory rental practices and high housing costs mean that racially marginalized youth face fewer viable options. And this is backed by evidence provided by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which states that racialized families have higher rates of housing challenges and lower rates of home ownership. And so these are stories, facts, and figures that I personally resonate with as well. I can remember a story my family shared with me when my parents went to go look at a rental unit in Toronto. And they made it to the unit for their appointment just to scope it out. That day it was raining, and so they were waiting outside in the rain, outside the rental unit for over an hour. Now, there was a car that was parked in the parking lot. And after that hour passed, that person got out of the car, met my parents at the door, and asked them if they were there to see the rental unit. They said yes. And that person told them that they don't rent to Black people. And so it's disheartening, but it speaks to some of the very real realities that systemically marginalized people can encounter when looking for housing. The good news is that there are supports, and many of them are youth-centered and trauma-informed and can help to stabilize youth and reduce risk of justice involvement. And so there's programs like Housing First for Youth, who provide immediate access to safe housing, plus tailored supports that help youth to stay connected to education, health, and community opportunities, stemming beyond just shelter and moving into the space of providing wraparound supports. There's also community-based transitional and supported housing programs like those offered by Covenant House and YMCA, and they give young people not just housing or housing supports, but case management supports. They provide opportunities for life skills training, mental health supports, and connections to jobs and school supports. And there's also rent support and housing stabilization programs, such as those that offer rent subsidies and ongoing follow-up care after shelter is secured. And they help provide youth supports to intervene and break the cycle back into homelessness once they've secured housing. On top of this, there's advocates and research groups that are calling for integrated tenant education and stronger eviction and prevention policies. And so there's work being done. Of course, the housing sector is one of the most challenging ones to navigate, especially as practitioners who support individuals who are looking for housing. But there are supports that are available that can assist in supporting our clients, especially youth. And so these supports contribute to making that positive difference, because housing stability is tightly linked to emotional safety, identity formation, and the ability to participate meaningfully in school and community life, especially for young people. And so when we think about housing, we should definitely transition our thoughts to expand just beyond thinking about the physical structure, such as the beds and the roofs that youth will live and work under. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And so when we're talking about the conditions that allow youth to rest, recover, and thrive, we should also consider housing within those conversations as well. Right. So we're going to shift into the second of 3 systems, and we're going to look at the child welfare system. So when we talk about child welfare, we're talking about a system that was intended to protect young people from harm and keep them safe. But it's also a system that many youth experience as harmful itself. Many youth consider the child welfare system to be evasive and controlling, especially during what should be formative years of identity development, education, connection, and autonomy. And so for some young people, involvement with the child welfare system means separation from family and community, the only environments they've ever known. It could mean supervision orders or investigations that feel highly intrusive. It could mean hypersurveillance of their daily lives, limiting self-agency and control and stunting identity development. Or it could mean frequent moves between placements that disrupt routines and relationships. And additional challenges that youth can face include school disruption, such as frequent placements, and changes that could result in the need or could result in the outcome of making education and learning more difficult. Additional challenges could also include increased mental health needs. So challenges such as anxiety or depression that often accompany trauma are sometimes treated as behavioral issues, resulting in criminalization rather than a cry for help and support from youth. And because placements can be disconnected from a young person's cultural, community, and family networks, young people can feel isolated from the very supports that breed belonging and identity around them. And so research in Canada shows that inconsistent placements are often associated with poorer academic, social, and emotional outcomes. And so what this tells us is that stability is important, and the more a young person moves, the harder it is to build trust with others, do well in school, or connect with supportive adults and peers. Another reality that some young people face is that conflict within group home or care settings is often acted on punitively, with young people disciplined or even criminalized for behaviors that are manifestations of stress, trauma, or unmet needs. And then there's the issue of aging out of care. So research shows that many young people leave the system at 18 with limited employment supports, housing options, or community ties, putting them at higher risk of homelessness, unemployment, and justice involvement compared with their peers from more stable home environments. And so for many of these youth, these are the experiences that are further shaped by colonial and systemic implications. So we have the residential school system and subsequent intergenerational effects that have contributed to the ongoing overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. A report by the Ontario Human Rights Commission revealed that the proportion of Indigenous children admitted into care was 2.6 times higher than their proportion in the child welfare population. Oh, sorry, their proportion in the overall child population. And then we also have the overrepresentation of Black youth in the welfare system. So there's One Vision, One Voice, and that is a program that was developed by the Ontario Children's Aid Society. And they released a report in 2018, and that report stated that Black children represent 7% of the child population in Ontario, but represent nearly 14% of the child welfare service population. And their overrepresentation was cited as factors that were caused by anti-Black racism. And so what does prevention really look like? And how can we collaborate across sectors to address and reduce the barriers within the child welfare system, as well as the ripple effects of those barriers on justice-involved youth? And how can we meaningfully improve the experiences of youth in care to prevent the negative outcomes that can stem from their involvement in these systems? So these are just a few questions that we can consider. Now we'll start with re-envisioning service delivery. So we can shift from surveillance and control towards an approach that centers on support and empowerment. And this means seeing youth as partners in their decisions that are made about their lives and listening to their concerns with empathy. We can continue prioritizing stability first placements, which are placement options that allow continuity of care, fewer moves, and better relationship building. Evidence from literature reviews and youth-serving organizations shows that continuity is one of the most strongest predictors of positive outcomes for youth in care. And we can also incorporate culturally responsive teams within this sector and within this work related in this area. We can ensure that workers understand, respect, and integrate youth's cultural background, language, and lived experiences into the decisions that go into making youth feel seen and respected. And we could use restorative responses in group care settings. And this can help to address issues in a restorative way. Instead of turning to punitive measures as a first resort for conflict or distress, using restorative practices, which some group homes do enforce, can help to repair relationships and teach coping skills. And in implementing these solutions, our goal can be to create conditions where young people feel seen, safe, and supported. And some of this work is being done. So these are some of the practices that have been proven to be effective and ways that we can move forward to continue offering support to youth in a meaningful way. And we're going to look at our last sector for today's discussion, and that is the justice sector. So when we talk about the justice system, we need to be clear that for a lot of young people, it's not something that they choose to engage in. I have yet to meet a young person who says, when I grow up, I want to go to jail. I want to come in contact with the police, and maybe it happens, but it's not something I've encountered yet. In most cases, the young people I've encountered the justice system as a result of decisions made by stress, confusion, lack of awareness, or crisis. And how youth experience the justice system has deep implications for their development, future opportunities that are available to them, as well as their well-being. So one of the most consistent realities I've encountered through Revitaled is that many young people have low levels of legal literacy. Research from youth legal advocacy organizations in Canada show that most young people don't understand factors such as, for example, their rights or how bail conditions work or what services are available to help them navigate these systems. And this was reinforced with the series of interviews that we did for our LawLantis project, the project through which this webinar is available today. This lack of legal literacy can escalate a minor encounter with the system into more serious system involvement. And so we also know that through surveillance and policing practices that are present in low-income communities, these practices represent and reflect disproportionate policing issues and also broader systemic issues within these policing systems. In Canada, Indigenous youth are significantly overrepresented in custody compared to their population share, and Black youth in some jurisdictions face higher rates of contact with police for similar low-level crime. And these patterns are well documented by institutions like Statistics Canada and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Now, for many of the conditions that youth are given in written legal language, it's hard for them to understand, especially without a lawyer present. And failing to meet those conditions, even for reasons that are out of their control, like transportation issues, for example, can lead to deeper system involvement. And it's not because youth are universally defiant, but in some cases, the system assumes compliance without checking accessibility. And justice involvement itself can create additional challenges. Studies in Canadian jurisdictions have found that contact with the justice system is associated with increased anxiety, trauma, and higher likelihood of falling behind academically, both because of the stigma as well as the stress associated with justice involvement. At the same time, access to legal aid remains uneven. While legal aid services exist, many young people are aware of them or face barriers when accessing them. So, what does prevention look like within the justice system? How can we work towards building sectors that reduce barriers, that bring young people into contact in the system in the first place? And how can we improve their experiences within it to better support outcomes that result in safer communities for all? Well, we can look at youth-friendly legal education, like LawLantis, for example, and youth-friendly legal education that, more importantly, breaks down complex legal terms in ways that youth understand. Programs delivered in schools and community spaces help youth to understand the laws before they even encounter it in crisis. And there are programs that exist through organizations like the Ontario Justice Education Network and Law in Action within schools. And they offer room for further engagement and increased accessibility to youth-friendly legal education. We can also strengthen community level education around legal aid and available resources to ensure that youth and their families are aware of the resources that they can access. Many don't know that services like legal aid clinics or duty counsel exist, or how to access them in a timely manner. And by increasing awareness and improving delivery, we can take a more inclusive approach that recognizes intersectional identities and the way that systemic biases can increase the risk of justice involvement for certain groups. And for example, this could include tailoring resources to migrant families and non-native English speakers who often face additional social and language barriers when navigating the justice system. And finally, by investing in community-led hubs, we can provide youth with mentorship, growth-oriented opportunities, trauma-informed tools, and conflict resolution strategies. And these resources can address youth's immediate needs and help to shift their narrative from survival-based crime to pro-social paths to success. And I do want to note that I think prevention isn't only in the interest of community safety and development. It's more than just keeping youth out of trouble, but it's also about equipping them with the knowledge and the support and the resources to help them navigate risk and to navigate conflict and to practice accountability in ways that preserve opportunity as well as promote dignity. Right. And so we're going to dive into a case study. We're going to be using some interactive tools for today. We're going to be using Padlet offline. And so you can access our Padlet page by scanning the QR code on the screen. There will also be a link that will be dropped in the chat for you to access. And we're just going to be answering a few reflective questions on a case study that we came up with. And so the case study is right here. I'm going to be reading this out for everyone while everybody gets connected to our Padlet page. And so we're going to be following the story of Jaden's pathway. So Jaden is a 50-year-old Black male. Over the last year, his family has experienced housing instability due to rising rent and job insecurity. Jaden has moved 3 times in less than 12 months, including a brief stay with extended family and time in a shelter. Each move disrupted his schooling. Jaden has missed weeks of classes, he has fallen behind in credits, and is at risk of failing multiple courses. He feels disconnected from school staff and has been informally discouraged from attending while things get sorted out. At home, conflict has increased due to his uncle's potential deportation and financial pressures. Children's Aid Society is lightly involved after a school referral, and from his perspective, they're more concerned on monitoring than helping. Jaden is anxious about CAS's involvement and worries about being separated from his family. Jaden has also been showing signs of depression, for example, withdrawing from friends, sleeping poorly, but he hasn't accessed counseling due to long wait lists at free clinics and uncertainty about where else to go. Recently, Jaden was stopped by police after being accused of shoplifting from a convenience store. Jaden says he was pressured by his peers and didn't fully understand his rights during the interaction. He was released to his mother but may face a charge. Jaden feels overwhelmed, confused about what will happen next, and unsure of who is on his side. So we are going to flip over to our Padlet page. Hopefully everyone was able to get connected. And we're going to answer some of these questions. So based on the story that was shared, and feel free to also drop your comments in the chat if you prefer as well, what factors might be contributing to the pressure that Jaden is experiencing? Where can Jaden and or his family find support to navigate their situation? And what interventions could be offered to Jaden to reduce the likelihood of deeper justice involvement? And what we can also do is drop the scenario in the chat. I'll stop sharing and see if we can get that up and running as well in the meantime. All right, let's get the scenario back up on the screen. Right. Are there any thoughts or comments on some of the questions that we have here about Jaden's pathway? And we could also find a way to unmute the mics as well in case there is someone who'd like to come off mic. Great. Right. Awesome. We have a response on the screen. So potential factors that might be contributing to the pressure Jaden is experiencing. We have valiant tilapia, housing insecurity, lack of engagement or belonging in school, economic stress, and mental health. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it definitely speaks, I think, to the earlier framework that we took a look at, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Um, there's just one issue kind of impacting another issue, which impacts another issue. And at least in reading Jaden's story, like if I were to take a look at it from fresh eyes, I could definitely see that there are connections, and the the one issue that he might be experiencing might be connected to another for sure. And these are some of the issues that come to mind as well for me. Yeah. I'll keep the Padlet open for maybe another minute or two, see if there's any other thoughts or comments on Jaden's story. And again, feel free to come off mic or drop some comments in the chat as well, just on your thoughts. All right. Another comment. So where can Jaden, or when responding to this question, where can Jaden and or his family find support to navigate their situation? Another comment says social services through local or provincial governments, such as income supports, mental health, etc. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Right. Right. And I'm not sure if there's any questions as well as we near the end of today's session. I'll be handing it over to Cynthia shortly just to close us off for today. But feel free as well, like even if ideas or thoughts come back to you about today's discussion at a later point in time, this Padlet will be open. And so if you'd like to come back and contribute thoughts later, that is more than welcome. So, okay. Cynthia, I think I'm going to hand it over to you. We'll keep, again, the Padlet open in case there are more thoughts that come in later.
Okay.
And
I was just for the presentation.
yes, presentation, sorry. Quick technological shift. Do. And we are up and running.
Okay, so we just want to briefly introduce LawLantis project that the team has been working on for some time. So LawLantis is an interactive, research-based youth justice education program that's designed to help youth understand how Ontario's youth legal system actually works. So fewer than half of Canadian students can correctly identify basic Youth Criminal Justice Act processes, including the minimum age of criminal responsibility, for example. At the same time, Black and Indigenous youth remain overrepresented embedded in the justice system, and traditional legal education hasn't necessarily been enough. And research shows that gamified learning can actually increase engagement and knowledge retention by up to 40%. So to ensure this game is community built and research based, we had conducted over 50 hours of interviews with lawyers, youth, and professionals who work with youth, such as teachers and also social workers. All of the themes that we gathered from these interviews guided the workshop that Jasmyne had led today, as well as the other workshops in our LawLantis Lunch and Learn mini-series. And most importantly, it directly influences the game's overall premise, structure, and design. So just to give you a background on what LawLantis is about, LawLantis follows the story of Seamus, a 15-year-old Afro-Indigenous teen who's rebuilding his life after instability in the child welfare system. When Adair turns into a shoplifting charge, players step into his shoes and essentially navigate racial bias, legal complexity, and life-altering decisions while trying to protect his future and the fragile trust he's built with his guardian Mona. And throughout the gameplay, youth get to learn about their rights, understand the YCGA and diversion options like restorative justice, and practice critical decision-making and advocacy skills. So, in keeping with the community-centered theme and mission that we have at Revital, we're celebrating the launch of this game with our LawLantis launch event. So this event is a youth justice and community building experience at the intersection of education, innovation, and advocacy. And this event not only takes time to commemorate all the work that we've done, but it will also serve as an innovative think tank where we can learn from one another and also be challenged to implement different solutions to basically improve our community safety and wellness, specifically for youth and the community at large. So this event is specifically designed for youth, families, educators, and community leaders, the very people who essentially helped shape to co-create this game with us. So on-site guests will be able to try LawLantis at our interactive game booth, and as well as explore how immersive storytelling and gamified education can strengthen legal literacy. We'll hear from our keynote speaker and registered social worker, Brianna Phillip, who will be delivering a youth-centered presentation on youth building legal literacy and youth empowerment. We'll also experience a powerful spoken word performance by award-winning artist Al D. Lyon, who will inspire and challenge us to think about resilience. We'll engage in collaborative justice building activities that ask, what does justice look like today, and what must we do to exactly achieve that? There will also be many more opportunities to support our work through a silent auction and a fundraiser. Lunch will also be served, and Uber vouchers will be available to ensure that all youth can attend without any barriers. So this event is free, so it's accessible to all. It's in person, and it will happen on Tuesday, March 17th from 10:45 to 1 p.m. and doors will open at 10:30 a.m. And this event will be held at the Audley Recreation Center in Ajax. And the register link will be provided in the chat for anyone who's interested in attending. And if I'm not mistaken, registration should close tomorrow.
That is correct. We're almost at capacity. Registration closes tomorrow, so feel free to share this invite with friends, family, and anyone you think would benefit. Right? And yeah, that brings us to the end of today's presentation and workshop. Thank you so much again for everyone and your attendance. Thank you to Cynthia for moderating. And we hope to see you at the launch event in a couple weeks. So take care, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.